Matt had always prided himself on his ability to trust. Trust in people, trust in his instincts, and most importantly, trust in Jessica, his wife of 10 years. They'd built a life together that he thought was solid, unshakable even. But lately, something felt off. It wasn't one glaring thing, no lipstick stains on shirts or suspicious phone calls in the dead of night. It was a string of tiny inconsistencies that began to gnaw at him like termites hidden within the beams of a sturdy home. Jessica's new hobby was volunteering, a decision she'd made about 6 weeks ago. "It's for a good cause," she'd said, flashing her trademark smile that had once melted away any doubt in Matt's mind. The charity, some local effort to distribute care packages to the homeless, sounded noble. It even made him feel proud, at first. But the late hours, the very late hours, were unusual. The Jessica he knew had never been much of a night owl, often asleep by 10 after a warm cup of chamomile tea. Now she was coming home well past midnight, hair tousled, a faint hint of perfume clinging to her skin even though the work was supposedly gritty. At first he dismissed his unease. Jessica was charismatic, and her love for helping others was one of the things that had drawn him to her in the first place. Yet, as the weeks dragged on, her stories grew vaguer. When he'd ask how her evening had gone, she'd smile tightly and say, "Oh, you know the usual. Lots of sorting, handing things out, really rewarding." Her tone was breezy, her body language off. The details never matched. One night she mentioned handing out blankets at a downtown park. The next, her story shifted to a shelter on the opposite side of town. Matt told himself he was imagining things. Stress from work, maybe. But then there was her phone, always glued to her hand. Jessica had always been a social media scroller, but lately, her texts had become constant, her screen lighting up at odd hours. When he'd glance over, she'd tuck the phone away, laughing nervously. "It's just work stuff." Work stuff at nearly midnight? The tension coiled tighter. The final straw came one Friday evening. Jessica stood in front of their full-length mirror, applying makeup with an unusual level of care. Her dress, a casual sundress that hugged her frame just right, seemed a little too flattering for a night of folding and sorting supplies. "What's with the getup?" Matt asked, keeping his voice light. "Did the charity upgrade to black tie events?" Jessica laughed, waving him off. "Oh, come on, Matt. Just because I'm volunteering doesn't mean I can't look nice. You never used to dress like this for sorting boxes." "Well," she said, snapping the cap onto her lipstick, "maybe I've just decided to take more pride in my appearance." Her tone was teasing, but the look in her eyes dared him to challenge her. Something inside him hardened. He had learned to pick his battles, but this one wasn't going to be ignored. That night, as she drove off in her sedan, he reached into the drawer where he'd stashed a GPS tracker. Matt wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but something had compelled him to buy the device a week ago. Call it a hunch, or maybe it was just the tiny voice whispering in his ear that Jessica's version of events didn't add up. He activated the app on his phone and watched the blinking dot as it moved across the city map. For the first 15 minutes her route appeared normal, heading downtown, just as she always claimed. But then the dot veered east, toward a quieter, more residential part of town. Matt's pulse quickened. There were no shelters out there, no parks or community centers. Just rows of apartments and condos. Matt grabbed his car keys, his hands trembling slightly. Whatever Jessica was hiding, he was going to find out. He didn't feel angry, not yet, just cold, detached. The truth was out there, and he was ready to face it no matter what it might cost. Matt followed Jessica's car at a safe distance, his palms slick against the steering wheel. He had never thought of himself as the suspicious type, let alone the kind of man who would tail his own wife. But as he maneuvered his car through the quiet streets, the rhythm of his breathing matched the relentless drumbeat of dread growing louder in his chest. His headlights stayed dim, his distance cautious, ensuring he wasn't seen. Her route grew increasingly odd, meandering through suburban neighborhoods rather than heading toward the gritty downtown streets she'd described in her volunteering stories. At one point she slowed near an intersection. Matt's heart leapt into his throat, thinking she might have noticed him. But she turned left, as if her route was predetermined. This wasn't a wrong turn or a detour, it was deliberate. After another 10 minutes, Jessica's car came to a stop outside a mid-size apartment complex. The building was nondescript, its beige siding and dark windows giving no hint of its occupants. Matt pulled into a spot down the block, his car idling as he watched her silhouette exit the vehicle. His stomach tightened as she smoothed her dress, checking her reflection in the car window before striding purposefully toward one of the entrances. She didn't hesitate. She'd clearly been here before. Matt killed the engine, his fingers gripping the keys so tightly they left marks in his palm. He debated what to do next. This was the moment he'd hoped he'd never face, the one where suspicion turned into confirmation. But a part of him, the small sliver of hope that had kept him steady all these weeks, whispered that there could still be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was meeting someone from the charity. Maybe she was here for work. Maybe the faint glow of a light flickering on in a second-floor window shattered those thoughts. Matt's gaze locked onto the illuminated rectangle where a figure moved behind the curtains. His wife's silhouette, unmistakable even through the gauzy fabric, was greeted by another man's. The two forms drew close, their outlines merging into a single shadow. Then, the curtain fell shut. Matt leaned back in his seat, the air in the car suddenly thick and suffocating. His chest felt hollow, his thoughts spinning in a chaotic mess. He had suspected, yes, but seeing it so blatantly, so undeniably, was a different matter entirely. This wasn't a moment of misunderstanding, it was betrayal, plain and unvarnished, laid bare under the dim light of a stranger's apartment. For what felt like hours, Matt sat frozen, torn between fury and despair. His instincts as a rational, even-tempered man fought against the tidal wave of emotions threatening to consume him. He wanted to charge up those stairs, pound on the door, and demand an explanation. He wanted to shout, to scream, to expose her lies in front of whoever had stolen her away. But he also knew that once he crossed that threshold, there would be no going back. Instead, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen as he considered his next move. Evidence. He needed proof, not just for himself, but for the fallout that would inevitably follow. With a deep breath, he opened the camera app and zoomed in on the second-floor window. The curtain was still closed, but he could faintly make out their shadows moving inside. He snapped several photos, the click of the shutter almost deafening in the silence of the car. Jessica had always been the more social one in their marriage, the one who thrived on community events, family gatherings, and charity work. But even she wouldn't be able to explain this away. No amount of charm or deflection could make her presence here seem innocent. The Jessica he thought he knew, the woman who once laughed at his terrible jokes, who cried when they watched sad movies together, felt like a stranger now. As he waited, the minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The apartment complex was eerily quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound in the air. Matt's thoughts churned relentlessly. Was this the first time? How long had this been going on? Was it the same man every time, or had there been others? The questions came faster than he could process them, each one cutting deeper than the last. Then the door to the apartment building opened. Jessica stepped out, her hair slightly disheveled, her walk slower than it had been when she arrived. She paused on the steps, glancing over her shoulder as if reluctant to leave. A man followed behind her, leaning casually against the doorframe. Matt squinted, trying to make out his face in the dim light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of confident smirk that made Matt's fists clench instinctively. The man leaned down, saying something to Jessica that made her laugh softly. She touched his arm, an intimate, familiar gesture that spoke volumes. Then, with one final glance, she turned and headed toward her car. The man watched her go, his smirk never wavering, before retreating back inside. Matt slumped against his seat, the weight of what he'd witnessed crashing down on him. There was no denying it now. Jessica wasn't volunteering, wasn't out saving the world one care package at a time. She was here, with him, with someone else. As her car pulled out of the lot, Matt let her drive away without following. He didn't need to trail her back home to confirm what he already knew. Instead, he waited, staring at the apartment complex as though it might reveal the answers to all his questions. He felt a deep, simmering anger begin to replace the initial wave of heartbreak. This wasn't just about Jessica's betrayal. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the calculated way she'd looked him in the eyes and made him believe she was someone she clearly wasn't. By the time Matt started his car and drove home, he knew what he had to do. The evidence he'd gathered would be enough. Enough to confront her, to force her to tell him the truth he already knew. Enough to make her understand that their marriage, the life they'd built together, was about to change forever. Matt barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with scenarios of what the following day would bring. Jessica slept soundly beside him, her even breaths mocking him with their tranquility. The same woman who had returned late last night, walking through their door as if nothing had happened, was now curled up under their blankets, her hand resting on his side of the bed as though she were innocent. The audacity of it was staggering, but Matt held back, letting the anger simmer until the moment was right. The next morning, Jessica moved about the house with her usual cheer. She hummed as she brewed coffee, scrolling through her phone and laughing at something on the screen. It was all so casual, so normal, that Matt wondered how she managed to live such a double life without a shred of guilt showing on her face. He watched her from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, silently rehearsing the words he would say. But this confrontation couldn't happen here, not in their kitchen, surrounded by reminders of their shared life. It had to happen somewhere private, somewhere controlled. "Hey Jess," he said, forcing his voice to sound light. "Are you free for lunch today? Thought we could spend some time together, just the two of us." Jessica turned to him, her face lighting up. "That sounds nice. Let me just check my calendar," she said, tapping at her phone. "I think I'm free around 1. Does that work?" "Perfect," Matt replied. His heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. "Let's meet at Mackenzie's, the diner by your office." Jessica smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Sounds good. I'll see you there." When she left for work, Matt set his plan into motion. He gathered the photos and video evidence he'd captured, organizing them on his tablet. He didn't want this confrontation to devolve into a shouting match or accusations she could wriggle out of. He wanted undeniable proof, something that would force her to face the truth. Once the files were ready, he grabbed his keys and headed out early, arriving at the diner well before the scheduled time. The diner was quiet, the lunchtime crowd yet to arrive. Matt chose a booth in the far corner, away from prying eyes and ears, and ordered a coffee he had no intention of drinking. When Jessica arrived, she breezed in with her usual confidence, her sundress flowing lightly around her. She leaned down to kiss his cheek, and Matt fought the instinct to pull away. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not here." "Hey, you're early," Jessica said as she slid into the booth. "You must have been really craving diner food." Matt forced a small smile. Something like that. They ordered their meals, exchanging small talk as Jessica detailed her morning. Matt nodded along, though he didn't process a word she was saying. His focus was on the tablet in his bag, on the weight of the conversation about to unfold. Finally, when the waitress cleared their plates, Matt leaned back and took a deep breath. "Jess," he began, his tone calm but firm, "we need to talk." Her brow furrowed slightly, her smile faltering. "Sure. What's going on?" Matt reached into his bag and placed the tablet on the table, sliding it toward her. "I need you to look at this." Jessica hesitated, glancing between him and the screen. "Just hoped," Matt said, his voice quiet but unyielding. Jessica picked up the tablet and pressed play on the video he'd queued up. The grainy footage showed her walking into the apartment complex, her familiar silhouette unmistakable. Then came the shadows through the curtain, the blurred outlines of her and the man behind closed doors. Her face drained of color as the realization set in. "Matt," she began, her voice shaking, "this isn't what it looks like." "Don't," Matt interrupted, his tone icy. "Don't insult me with that line. I sat in my car and watched you walk into that building. I watched you greet him at the door, and I watched you leave hours later, so don't you dare try to tell me it's not what it looks like." Jessica's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in years, Matt saw her without her usual poise and confidence. She was flustered, scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't come. "How long?" he demanded, his voice steady but loaded with emotion. "How long has this been going on?" Jessica swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she set the tablet down. "A few months," she admitted quietly, her eyes welling with tears. "I never meant for it to happen, Matt. I swear, it just what?" Matt cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "It just happened. Don't give me that. Affairs don't just happen, Jessica. You made a choice. A series of choices. Every text, every drive to his place, every excuse you gave me about where you were. You chose to do this." Jessica wiped at her tears, shaking her head. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Oh," Matt snapped, his fist pounding the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. The other diners turned briefly, but he didn't care. "You didn't want to hurt me? Then why didn't you stop? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Or better yet, Why didn't you just leave if I wasn't enough for you?" Her lip quivered as she tried to form a response, but Matt didn't give her the chance. "You've been lying to me for months, Jess. You've been sleeping in my bed, eating at my table, looking me in the eyes and telling me you love me while you're sneaking off to see someone else. Do you even realize what you've done?" "I love you, Matt," Jessica said desperately, reaching for his hand. "I do. I know I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can—" Matt pulled his hand away, his expression hard. "No, Jessica. You don't get to fix this. You don't get to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. This isn't something we can come back from." Her tears fell freely now, her composure completely shattered. "Please, Matt, I'm sorry. I was stupid, and I didn't think—" "You thought plenty," Matt said, his voice cold. "You thought about every lie, every excuse, every time you covered your tracks. You were careful, Jess, deliberate. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice." The silence between them was deafening. Jessica looked at him, pleading with her eyes, but Matt had already made up his mind. He slid the tablet back into his bag and stood, throwing a few bills onto the table to cover the check. "This is over, Jessica," he said, his voice low but firm. "Whatever we had, whatever life we built, it's done. I'll be filing for divorce." Jessica's sobs followed him as he walked out of the diner, but Matt didn't look back. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest began to lift. The confrontation had ended not with fireworks, but with the quiet, resolute end of something he'd once thought was unbreakable. The days following the confrontation at the diner were surreal for Matt. He moved through his routine like a man wading through molasses, every task heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Jessica had tried calling him that night and the night after, leaving tearful voicemails and sending text messages filled with apologies, excuses, and desperate pleas to talk. But Matt ignored them all. He couldn't stomach her words, her voice, not after everything she had done. The first step he took was practical, securing a lawyer. He contacted Rebecca Neal, a no-nonsense divorce attorney who had been recommended by a friend. Rebecca's office was small but efficient, the kind of place that prioritized results over frills. When Matt explained his situation, laying out the evidence he had gathered in the confrontation at the diner, Rebecca nodded with the kind of grim professionalism that showed she'd heard stories like his far too often. "This is a clean case of infidelity," Rebecca said, her pen moving swiftly over her notepad. "With the proof you've provided, there's no way she can contest this divorce. Are there any assets or shared properties we need to discuss?" Matt sighed. "Just the house and our savings. No kids, no major debts." Rebecca glanced up at him. "That makes things easier, but be prepared. Cases like this can get messy. She might not take it well, especially if she feels like she's losing control of the narrative." Jessica losing control. The idea was almost laughable. Jessica had always been the kind of person who thrived on being the center of attention, the one who dictated the story. Whether it was among friends, at work, or in their marriage, she had a knack for steering conversations and situations to her advantage. But now, with her betrayal exposed and the divorce underway, Matt held the reins for the first time in their relationship. Word began to spread quickly. Mutual friends noticed the sudden absence of Jessica on Matt's social media, the lack of their usual cheerful couple photos. Jessica had always loved curating their image, ensuring they looked like the perfect married pair. Dinners out, vacations, cozy weekends at home. But now the silence spoke louder than any caption. It didn't take long for people to start asking questions. At first, Matt kept things vague. He wasn't the type to air dirty laundry, and he hated the idea of dragging their private life into the public eye. But then Jessica made the first move. One afternoon, while scrolling through his phone, Matt stumbled across her latest post. A lengthy, teary-eyed video in which she claimed their marriage was falling apart due to communication issues and growing apart. Not once did she mention the affair or her late-night escapades. Instead, she painted herself as a heartbroken wife, trying to salvage what little remained of their relationship. Matt stared at the screen, his anger rising with each carefully chosen word. She was trying to rewrite history, erasing her betrayal and spinning the narrative to make herself look like the victim. It was infuriating, but more than that, it was insulting. Did she really think he would stay silent? That he wouldn't defend himself? He didn't respond publicly, not yet. Instead, he reached out to a handful of close friends and family members, sharing the truth privately. He showed them the photos and videos, the undeniable evidence of Jessica's infidelity. The reactions varied: shock, anger, disappointment. His mother was particularly devastated. She always seemed so sweet, so genuine, his mother said, her voice trembling. How could she do this to you? Matt didn't have an answer. He didn't know how someone could live a double life so seamlessly, so brazenly, without a shred of remorse until they were caught. Jessica, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her lover, Chris, the man from the apartment, had apparently distanced himself as soon as the confrontation became public knowledge. Word had gotten back to him that Matt wasn't going to take this lying down, and Chris wasn't willing to risk his own reputation. Without Chris to lean in on, Jessica's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. One night she showed up at Matt's doorstep unannounced. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon, and the sight of her standing there clutching a box of his favorite beer like some kind of peace offering made his stomach turn. "Matt, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Can we just talk? I need to explain." "You've explained enough," Matt cut her off, his voice cold. "There's nothing left to say, Jessica." She stepped closer, her eyes wide and glassy. "I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over." "Fix what?" Matt demanded, his anger flaring. "Fix the months of lies, the sneaking around, the fact that you destroyed everything we built because you couldn't be honest? There's no fixing this, Jess." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I still love you," she whispered. "You're my husband, you're my home." Matt's chest tightened, but he refused to let her words sway him. "You should have thought about that before you walked into another man's apartment," he said, stepping back and closing the door. The fallout wasn't confined to their personal lives. Jessica's reputation at work took a hit as well. While she hadn't explicitly mentioned her lover's name in her posts, people started connecting the dots. Whispers circulated in her office, and her once friendly colleagues began keeping their distance. The shine of her charisma dulled under the weight of her exposed hypocrisy. For Matt, the hardest part wasn't dealing with Jessica's unraveling or the gossip among their friends. It was the quiet moments alone, the nights when he sat in their now empty home and felt the full weight of her betrayal. He thought about the years they had spent together, the promises they had made, the future they had planned. And then he thought about how easily she had thrown it all away. He started therapy, something he'd never considered before. At first he wasn't sure it would help, but sitting across from someone who listened without judgment was a relief he hadn't realized he needed. He talked about the anger, the hurt, the sense of loss. And slowly, bit by bit, he began to feel lighter. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, Matt found himself reclaiming pieces of his life. He reconnected with old friends, threw himself into his work, and even started running again, a hobby he'd abandoned years ago. It wasn't easy, and the scars of Jessica's betrayal would take time to heal. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of control, of clarity. Jessica, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had shattered. Her attempts to regain sympathy fell flat, her carefully constructed image tarnished beyond repair. And as Matt signed the final divorce papers, he felt a strange sense of peace. The fallout had been messy, painful, and humbling, but it had also been a reminder of his own strength. He had faced the storm and come out the other side, bruised but unbroken. And now, for the first time in years, he was ready to start over. The finality of the divorce was both a relief and a reckoning for Matt. Signing those papers felt like severing the last thread of a frayed rope, tethering him to a life that no longer existed. As he walked out of his lawyer's office on a chilly afternoon, the wind seemed to carry away some of the weight that had been pressing on his chest for months. The life he'd built with Jessica was over. But in its place, a blank slate stretched out before him, a daunting yet liberating prospect. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, was now eerily quiet. Jessica had moved out weeks ago, taking her things and leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the hollow echo of absence. For a while, Matt couldn't bring himself to sit in the living room or sleep in their bed. He felt haunted not by her presence, but by the memory of how happy they had once been. Every corner of the house whispered of trust broken and promises discarded. But as the weeks turned into months, the house began to feel less like a mausoleum for his failed marriage and more like a space he could reclaim. He started with small changes, replacing the throw pillows Jessica had insisted on with ones he liked, rearranging the furniture, and painting the walls a calming shade of blue. The act of transforming the space gave him a sense of ownership, a reminder that his life was now his alone to shape. Jessica, on the other hand, was struggling to rebuild her life. Without Matt's steady presence, the cracks in her facade became more apparent. Chris, the man she had risked everything for, had disappeared not long after their affair came to light. Rumors swirled about his abrupt relocation to another city, leaving Jessica without the safety net she had relied on. Her attempts to garner sympathy from friends and family had largely failed, as many saw her actions for what they were: a selfish betrayal. Matt had no interest in her struggles. He wasn't vindictive by nature, but he also knew he couldn't allow himself to get caught in her orbit again. When she reached out, texts filled with vague apologies or attempts to reminisce about better times, he ignored her. He owed her nothing now, and engaging with her would only reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal. Instead, Matt focused on building a new routine. Therapy became a cornerstone of his recovery, offering him a safe space to process the complex emotions he was grappling with. His therapist helped him confront not only the pain of Jessica's betrayal, but also the guilt and self-doubt that had crept into his mind. Was there something he had done wrong? Had he missed warning signs? Could he have prevented this? These questions had plagued him in the aftermath, but therapy helped him see that the fault lay with Jessica's choices, not his. He also reconnected with friends he had drifted away from during his marriage. Nights out with the guys, something he hadn't prioritized in years, reminded him of the importance of camaraderie and laughter. He rekindled a long-forgotten love for running, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. The quiet moments on early morning jogs gave him clarity, a chance to reflect on the man he was becoming. The biggest change came in how Matt viewed himself. For so long, his identity had been tied to being Jessica's husband, to building a life together and ensuring her happiness. In the aftermath of the divorce, he realized he hadn't given enough thought to his own needs, his own dreams. What did he want out of life? What kind of future did he envision now that it was his alone to design? One evening, while sorting through old photos, Matt stumbled upon a picture of himself from years ago. He was standing on a hiking trail, arms outstretched, grinning as the sun set behind him. It was from a solo trip he'd taken before meeting Jessica, a time when he'd felt free and adventurous. The memory sparked something in him, a reminder that there was a version of himself untouched by the weight of betrayal, a version he could return to. He booked a weekend trip to a nearby national park, a small but significant step toward rediscovering that part of himself. The solitude of the mountains, the crisp air, and the challenge of the trails gave him a sense of renewal. He wasn't running away from his past, he was stepping into his future. As time passed, Matt began to see Jessica's betrayal not just as an ending, but as a turning point. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, to reevaluate his life and priorities. The pain had been immense, but it had also been a catalyst for growth. He found himself more resilient, more attuned to his own needs, and more aware of the kind of relationships he wanted to nurture moving forward. Jessica's absence no longer felt like a void. It felt like space to breathe, to think, to live. The lessons he'd learned from their marriage, both the good and the bad, became guideposts for the man he was becoming. He knew he still had a long way to go, that there would be moments of doubt and sadness, but he also knew he was strong enough to face them. On a cool autumn evening, Matt sat on his porch, a cup of tea warming his hands as he watched the leaves drift lazily to the ground. The world felt quieter now, more peaceful. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, naive, trusting, unprepared for the storm that would upend his life. And then he thought about the man he was now, wiser, stronger, and ready to move forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Matt allowed himself a small smile. His life had been shattered, yes, but in the process of piecing it back together, he had discovered something unexpected: himself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.